Okay, so to start off this project, I kind of wanted to figure out where I wanted the shelf to go. So using painter's tape, we kind of marked out the height and how wide and how thick the shelf is going. Okay, tape. Thank you.
Okay, so now that I'm happy with the position of the shelf, I then pulled back the tape and then marked it out using a pencil, making sure that my markings are nice and level and plumb. And then cleared the area and removed the baseboard of that section in preparation to remove the drywall. I then, using a stud finder, found the studs closest to the ends of the finished shelf, and then marked the center of that stud using my spirit level. Once everything was marked out, I then cut the drywall using my moldy tool. You want to make sure when cutting drywall that you don't cut too deep in case there's any wires or pipes just behind the drywall. Once a section of drywall was cut, I then removed the electrical faceplates and then began removing the actual drywall itself. Because the shelf's going on an exterior wall, I had to cut through the moisture barrier in a way that I could easily tape it back together once complete. I then finally cut and removed the insulation carefully, making sure not to cut through any wires. Once the stud-work was exposed, it's now time to start the framing. I took a measurement from the back edge of the wall to how deep I want the shelf to be, and then cut those pieces out of 2x4s on my miter saw. And as I didn't want my shelf to be too thick, I then ripped them down to 3 inches on my table saw. I set my laser level 3/4 of an inch lower to the finished height of the shelf. I then adjusted and clamped a piece of wood to the level line, making sure that it's pushed right back to the exterior wall. I made sure it was level and adjusted where needed, and then screwed it to the stud wall. I then clamped another block below it, creating an L shape. I'll explain why in a minute. I then repeated those steps on all 4 of the exposed studs, making sure they all sit in line with the laser level.
Okay, so now that most of the framing for the shelf is done, and I think that it's strong enough to hold the shelf itself and a few things on it, I wanted to add a little bit of extra support just in case someone sits on it, or more likely someone climbs on it. I'm looking at you. So I'm gonna add a few of these L-shaped brackets that I picked up from Home Depot. I'm gonna bolt them on, screw them on, and then that should really stiffen things up.
This is why I created the L shape to accommodate for the metal bracket. I clamped the metal bracket to the framing center of the stud, and then drew the 1/2 inch holes to where the bolts will go through. I then drilled out the 1/2 inch hole with a 1/2 inch drill bit in my drill. For the bolts, I'm using 3 and 5 inch lag bolts with 1/2 inch nut and washers. Once the holes were drilled, I then put the lag bolts through the holes and then located the metal bracket over the bolts. I then placed a washer and a nut on top of the bolts and then tightened them up equally. And again, I repeated all of those steps on all 4 of the studs. And as a final step, I added 1.5" screws to all the tiny holes, really locking the framing in tight. I then cut and attached a piece of wood spanning all 4 pieces of the framing. This will help tie in each piece together, creating one big strong unit. Directly underneath the far side of the shelf, I added an electrical outlet and another outlet which has a HDMI, an Ethernet cable and an internet connection. This is so I can have an internet point and then I can run a HDMI and an Ethernet cable directly to the back of the TV. This is so if I ever do find time to play video games, I don't have to see the ugly cables directly below the TV. I ran a HDMI and an Ethernet cable from that outlet to the back of the existing TV power supply. Once I successfully ran the cables, I then connected the TV power supply back up and then tucked the wires out of the way. Once I was happy with the framing, I then carefully put back the insulation. Separating them in half, put in a piece behind the wires and then put in a piece in front, making sure there's no gaps to collect pockets of cold air. I then cut the moisture barrier around the framing of the new shelf and then carefully tuck taped it back together using construction tape in its original place.
Okay, then now that the framing is complete and we're getting ready to drywall and then build the finished part of the shelf, but before we can do that, we gotta test it out and make sure it can hold some weight. And there's only one guy I know up for the task, and that's Spider-Man. So let's go give him a call.
So now that we know that it can withhold the mighty force of Spider-Man, I can put back the drywall, repair the mud over the cracks, and then repaint the walls. I then put back the baseboard and then repaired and repainted that whole section.
Okay, so now that the framing is complete, in and out of the drywall repair, I'm gonna make a start on the actual finished section of the floating shelf. Okay, so for the material of the shelf, I'm using 3/4 of an inch white oak veneered MDF. I'm gonna make it in a way so that the grain flows up and around and down the ends of the shelf, so it looks like one complete unit. So using a veneered MDF or plywood instead of a solid wood is not only lighter in weight, but it's also way more cost effective. So I've got my measurements, let's get them marked out and start cutting. Yeah.
Because the edge of the MDF was kinda rough, I put in a fresh new clean straight edge using my track saw, making sure that it's square from each end. As I wanted the shelf to be 13 inches in depth, I made a mark at 13 inches from the cut clean edge of the veneer. I then applied blue painter's tape over that mark to stop the veneer from splintering as I cut it. I set my track saw to a 45-degree angle and then began cutting the top section of the shelf to 13 inches. I then put the top section to side and then began cutting the middle section. I applied a new layer of tape to the edge of the veneer and then set my track from my track saw right at the very edge of the veneer, making sure that it's square from either end. And then coming from the opposite end, I cut a 45-degree angle on the edge of the veneer. I then carefully peeled back that tape and then made a mark from that cut at 4.5 inches. This will allow it to slide over the 3-inch framing. I then, at those marks, cut another 45-degree angle from the previous direction, creating a strip at 4.5 inches from point to point. I then set that aside, and then on the offcut, I then cut another 45-degree angle as close to the veneer as possible. And then from the angle I just cut, I marked and cut a 90-degree angle at 13 inches, creating the bottom section of the shelf. Once the top, middle and bottom sections were cut, I lined them up perfectly and then taped all three together. I then made a mark center of the sheet and then marked the overall lengths either side equal distances from the center mark. And then at those marks either end, I set my track saw to a 45-degree angle and then cut to those marks, making sure that it's nice and square from the edge of the sheet. Because the ends were too small to cut on my track saw, I cut them down on my table saw. So I set my table saw to a 45-degree angle and then cut a 45-degree angle to the top offcuts of the shelf. And then using the offcut of the middle section, I then set my fence to that exact measurement. I then cut the two top sections to the same depth as the middle section, with a 45-degree angle on either end.
Okay, so now that all the pieces are cut, it's time to start gluing it together. And because of the size and the shape of it, it's kind of awkward to use clamps, so I'll be using blue tape. So yeah, wish me luck.
I put the bottom section aside and then aligned up the top and middle sections together, and then taped them together using the blue painter's tape. I then flipped them over to glue them up. I applied a good amount of glue to the inside of the mitres and then smeared it around using my finger. The open grain of MDF will absorb a good amount of glue, so you want to top it up where necessary. Once glued up, I then brought the two mitres together, making sure there was no gaps on the underside. I then applied the same steps to the end pieces. I made sure to pull the tape nice and tight and then folded the mitres together. I then taped the corner, making sure there was no gaps. I repeated the exact same steps to the other end. I added more tape to the whole run, making sure that there was no to little gaps. Once the top, middle and side sections are in, I then glued up the remaining mitres ready for the next section. I also added a couple of temporary 3-inch blocks to help stop the shelf from sagging as I assemble it. I slid the next section in place and then taped it up following the exact same steps as before, trying to create no to little gaps throughout the whole seam. The very next day, I carefully peeled off the tape ready for sanding.
Okay, so now that it's dry, it's time to start the sanding. And sanding veneer can be tricky at times because you don't want to sand too much in one area because you'll burn through the veneer and then you'll have that crappy MDF or plywood sticking up through, and no one wants that. Piece is ruined. There's not really any coming back from that, so you want to try and avoid that. For me, I don't like using sanders on veneer. I always go with a 240 or a 320 grit sandpaper and a block and just take it nice and light and smooth, and don't stay in one area too much. Easy.
So I carefully removed any glue marks from the veneer using a 320 grit sandpaper on a block. Once the piece is free from glue and sanded, it's time to apply the finish. And as always, I'm using Osmo Oil Poly X. I apply a good amount of Osmo Oil using a white pad or a blue shop towel, buffing it into the grain. I then let it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes and then wipe off any of the excess using a blue shop towel. I do this on all visible surfaces of the shelf. To get the best possible finish out of Osmo Oil, it's best to give it 2 coats, so in between each coat I sand it down with 600 grit sandpaper, apply the second coat allowing 8 hours to dry in between. Once the finish had dried, I then slid the shelf into place over the shelf framing. I then carefully tapped and moved it into the position that I want.
Okay, so now that the finished part of the shelf is in its final place, I'm going to attach it by putting a couple little screws on the underside right at the very back through the bottom of the plywood shelf into the framework. This is going to stop it from any kind of little movement or someone pulling it. Also, while I have you here, I kind of want to speak my truth and tell you that my mitres were not 100% perfect. They were a little bit gappy here and there. I have a hairline gap, for instance, right here, and it's kind of bugging me. So I have a resolution for that, and that is these kind of colored wax sticks. They come in a bunch of different colors to suit whatever wood you're using. I'm using white oak, so I got a light oak colored stick. Essentially, you kind of rub it in the affected area, and they work well for like light scratches and light dents. And you just kind of rub it over, like rub it in with your finger, and then I use a nail or like a sharp blade and take off any of the excess, right? And then that should blend in any deficiencies. So I will link these in the description down below, but don't tell anyone.
Using a countersink and my drill, I pre-drilled 2 holes in line with the framing, and then screwed 2 1.25" screws through the veneer into that framing, holding the piece in place. And then cogged any of the gaps from the veneer to the drywall using a small amount of caulk. This just creates a nice clean transition from the finished veneer to the white drywall. I did this to all of the edges.